Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along and joining our Research Conversations webinar. This is hosted by the Australian and New Zealand Medical Radiation Research Network, and tonight's Research Conversations webinar is on the topic of qualitative research. So before we get started, I just wanted to give you some ideas of how this would probably best run. What we ask is that our guests keep their microphones muted, switched off during the webinar, and that way we can get the best sound quality from those people who are involved in the panel. If you do have questions throughout the webinar, please use the chat tool that's available in Zoom meeting. You can see if you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen, you'll see the little chat box, and type your questions in there. I'll keep an eye on that during the webinar and interrupt when appropriate to try and raise questions that you've raised to be addressed by the panel. So our hosts for this evening are Caroline and Gay, so I'll hand it over to you both to proceed with tonight's webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And are you okay to record this from your end?
Yes, the recording has started. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. 7:30 on the eastern side and lots of other times, including 9:30 New Zealand. So across lots of different time zones, across lots of different disciplines. And what we want to do today is really to give some insight from some esteemed radiation therapy and medical imaging researchers, particularly with an expertise in qualitative research, to get you to start thinking about how you might start to engage or strengthen the skills that you already have in qualitative research. My background is in radiation therapy as a qualitative researcher, and I will just let Gay introduce herself as well.
Yep. Good evening, everybody. Obviously, my name's Gay Dungy, and I work at the Otago University in New Zealand, but it's actually in Wellington, the campus, and teach on the radiation therapy program there. And I have most of my research has really been qualitative or mixed methods, actually. So that's where I've sort of come from and my interests are. So we invited people to write what their, what we'd like to do is get you all to perhaps pop in what your experience is with qualitative research. So if you can just write into the chat what sort of research you've had with, what sort of experience you've had with qualitative research, that would be quite good to know, just, and then that will be recorded as part of the process. So now perhaps we can get the panel to introduce themselves. So maybe Cynthia.
Hello, welcome, and thank you everybody for coming along. I am currently a senior lecturer at Monash in a very part-time capacity, I have to say. I'm a late bloomer. I discovered that when you finally get your PhD, you're called an early researcher, and I call myself an elderly researcher. So there's a lot of life after a PhD, but when you're working on it, it seems that the PhD is going to be the end of the road, which it definitely isn't. I think my area of interest is definitely qualitative. And I think what we have agreed as panel members, that each one of us will sort of fill in what we have been doing once we're answering some of the specific questions. So I won't go into any detail in terms of what I've done. I think that will emerge as we discuss the various questions that we're going to be looking at today. So thank you.
So,
hi, I'm Sue Merchant. Thanks everyone for inviting me onto the panel. I've certainly been involved in only really qualitative research, and I'm a late bloomer like Cynthia, and so I haven't been involved in too many projects, but currently involved in one with Caroline, and I've done a lot of work with Georgia, who is also on the panel this evening. So I might leave it at that as well, and just perhaps when the questions come, we can fill in some of the gaps with some of the things that I've found or discovered or explored along the way. So, thanks.
Great, thanks, Sue. Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew Kilgore. I'm Head of Discipline for Medical Radiation Science at Charles Sturt University. My research interests are along the lines of education and particularly workplace learning assessment in medical radiation science, and that lends itself to qualitative research. And I've also been involved in a large OLT grant on student involvement in rubric design, which was also qualitative. Thank you.
Great. Georgia. You there, Georgia?
Georgia may have nipped off.
Here, sorry.
You've taken your mic.
So I'm a radiation therapist background and completed my PhD, which was qualitative, and now working as a senior research fellow at Curtin University. And I'll talk more about my research as we go. And there's a baby in the background, sorry.
It's okay.
Great. Well, shall we start into the first question? So just to the panel, how would you define qualitative research? So, Cynthia.
You want me to start? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to say from a very sort of a large perspective that to me qualitative is as a voyage of discovery, because it brings out all of the unexpected things that you may not have presumed or hypothesized about. So as just a sort of a general opening statement, that's something that I feel very strongly about. I mean, if we get down to more specifics, I mean, it is a way of looking at social interaction in a way that it allows the interpretation of the subjectivity of attitudes and behaviors to be evaluated in a different way. And I know that there's always this sort of constraints between the quantitative needing to be totally objective and the qualitative, which is sometimes considered to be a sort of soft science, just because it doesn't have that underpinning of perhaps of statistical analysis, which is why I think a lot of people move towards the mixed methods, because it just it does sort of cover both sides. But certainly I've been very much wedded to the qualitative side of doing things, and have been able to, I think Gertz says it very well when he talks about learning about the thick descriptions that you're able to develop from qualitative. I won't go into the design or anything at all, because we've all probably got our own ideas, so I'll move on to the next person to give their ideas.
Right. Thanks, Cynthia. Sue?
I'd just like to put it as you can look at issues and complexities, and they can be examined and explored in depth. The sort of richness that Cynthia was just talking about, and I think that people do go into mixed methods because this can give the depth and the richness to some of the quantitative studies, and in quantitative studies you can't necessarily get that extra understanding and understanding about the underlying social concerns, issues, and the way people interact in the situations that occur. So I think qualitative research can give such great richness to the research.
True. Thank you. Andrew?
Thank you. I would say qualitative research is learning from people. When you do quantitative research, you get findings from, excuse me, findings from scientific observation, which is just cold hard facts or cold hard scientific observations. Whereas qualitative research is learning from people, how they think, how they interact, how they operate. And that's what draws me to it, because I think people are more interesting than scientific observations.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Georgia.
Yeah, qualitative research is good for getting people's perspectives, and I think it's really good as a starting point for when you're doing research. So it might lead into doing a quantitative study or doing a randomised controlled trial after you've got the qualitative data to understand people's perspectives. And I think it captures something that you don't get from the quantitative studies. And it's fun to do the interviews and get to know people and find out their perspectives. Understanding patient experience, for example, was something that you wouldn't get from a quantitative survey that you can perhaps get when you've talked to the patients in more detail.
Yep, that's true. Thank you. So, I'll stay with you, Georgia. What types of questions can be answered, do you think, using qualitative research?
So around patient experience, how people feel about the workplace. So mostly open questions and questions that haven't been looked at before is where your qualitative research fits into your project.
Right.
Sorry.
Good. Thank you. Andrew.
Okay, the types of questions that I think lend themselves to a qualitative methodology are the how and why questions. So talking to people, finding out why they do what they do, finding out what is your opinion about what has led you to come to that conclusion, what motivates your interactions with others. They're the types of questions that I believe lend themselves to qualitative research.
Great. Sue. I think questions, as the other two have said, questions about lived experiences and, for example, what a patient's understanding of the information that they've received, and or a student's experience during clinical placement, or the learning about the culture of a workplace and how that underlies what other activities or what other things are going on. All of these are what we discussed before. It's about human experiences and how we make sense of our world. And it's looking at different people's perspectives on things and then looking through that and gathering the data on those. So it's all about the human experience. Yeah, definitely. Cynthia, have you got anything else to add?
Well, I think it's been mainly said, and interesting that Susan mentions cultural. I mean, for me, in my study of cross-cultural experiences and lived-in experiences, that was another sort of added dimension, I think, to using qualitative as a way of drawing out experiences that are based on cultural differences. So that I found particularly interesting.
Great.
Okay, so now we've got a bit of an idea as to the types of questions, studies that you can address using qualitative research methods. What we want to try and do now is just drill down into the experience, because we are qualitative, we're interested in qualitative research, the experience of each of our panel members in terms of how you got started in qualitative research. We all know, I think, as medical radiation practitioners, that starting in research sometimes is a challenge because we're busy with our clinical load or educational load. We don't always have, the right people around us or know how to access those people. So we'd like to learn a little bit more really about how you got started, how you kind of got the I suppose the impetus to really engage with the qualitative side of research. This time I'm going to start with Sue.
Okay, well, I first started my journey in qualitative research is when I was convinced that I should do a PhD with Georgia being my principal supervisor. So that was back quite a number of years ago now when I first started out. Because I wanted to explore the interactions between radiation therapists and the patient and their patients, I ended up following, needing to look at qualitative research and look at the, from an observational point of view. So I did an ethnography. So I had as Cynthia, you did cultural aspects. I looked at the culture of radiation therapists and how they worked, and I observed for many hours within a radiation therapy department and then in another one. So this is where I first started with qualitative research and understanding that you end up with a lot of data. But it was a very interesting experience, and I had a very supportive principal supervisor in Georgia who had already undertaken her PhD in qualitative research. So I might add that I am a radiation therapist, and but I had to look at it. There's a what they call the insider-outsider in doing this sort of research. So it was quite interesting to be observing what and looking at the culture of radiation therapists, putting on my researcher hat rather than being the clinical radiation therapist at that time. Is there anything else you want me to? Is that enough at the moment?
Yeah, that's great, Sue. Thank you for that. And I think one of the aspects to qualitative research is being able to identify any potential biases that you might have because you are ingrained into, into a particular profession or discipline, and to be able to acknowledge those and be able to then analyse your data with kind of that in the back of your mind, knowing that you're not going to try not to influence, but just being really quite mindful of that. And that's one of I think that's part of the process of becoming a qualitative researcher, is that self-awareness of your own, your own stance.
So that's another aspect of it is reflective journaling the whole way through to ensure that you reflect back on what you've seen and try and process it and understand where you fit and the lens you're looking through and the perspective you bring to it and those biases, and so that anyone that eventually reads about your research, then they can understand the perspective and the viewpoint that you were taking, and then they can adapt from that.
Thanks, Sue. Great. I'll move on to Andrew now. Can you just give us a little bit of an insight into how you started on this journey?
Sure. Thanks, Cass. My first academic job was managing clinical placement for radiography students at University of Sydney. And when we started getting assessments of our students coming in from the clinical centres, it appeared to me that the assessment wasn't working, because we were getting every student getting top marks, and we knew that that wasn't the case. They weren't all brilliant. So I looked at the assessments that the other universities used, and none of them seemed to really drill down into the rich variance that happens between clinical centres, particularly in radiography. We have everything from small private practices to bush hospitals to large metro trauma centres. And we're getting students at the same level going to these widely different types of placements. So I set about trying to analyse what led to the way that our students were being assessed and how we could do it better. And it morphed into a PhD project where I did interviews and focus groups with my colleagues in Sydney, a group of students from Sydney, went to England and visited 6 different universities there and interviewed staff and some students there. We did a national survey through what was then AIR, now ANZMRRN, and put all that together in what we called, and I won't talk about this too much because it's more methodology which comes later, but we called it deconstruction, reconstruction. That was the methodology. We deconstructed or pulled apart all the information that we got from the data gathering and then reconstructed it in a way that made sense for how we assess our students. And I would say the impetus to do this came from the fact that I wanted to do my job better and make sure that we weren't putting graduates out who really didn't have a clue. That was the impetus to get involved in it.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And so I think that demonstrates that you can start off with a question, and it might be a small-ish scale study initially, and that can then lead to subsequent studies that can then make up the Master of Philosophy or PhD as a whole. So I think it's great for researchers that are just starting out to know that your question, it just has to be important to you. And, you know, I think that's one of the challenges with following up the PhD or a longer term project, is that you have to maintain that enthusiasm. And so it needs to be really, it's got to have personal meaning, I think.
You have to remember that your research is your research and not your supervisor's research. And if you have a supervisor who tries to push you into areas that you're not interested in, it's not going to work because you'll get sick of it.
Thank you. Great. Thanks for that pearl of wisdom, Andrew. I might just head over west to Georgia. And just to get a little bit of an insight, you've had quite a longish research career, and just to talk about how you got started, perhaps, and what the impetus was for you, Georgia.
Yep. So I started my work in my PhD looking at treatment decision making for patients with breast cancer. So that was a qualitative study trying to understand what their experiences are, what decisions they were making, using phenomenology. And then from there, post-PhD, I went more into looking at patient information needs and support needs. So that started with qualitative research, again, interviewing patients to find out what information needs they had in radiotherapy. And then moving through that, from the qualitative, we did a quantitative survey. And then from that, we were able to develop an intervention and then moved on to an RCT. So it really did shape, the qualitative research shaped what I ended up doing over more than 10 years. So starting with a PhD and then right through getting fellowships and research grants. But qualitative has always been there in the background, shaping what research I've done and what information or what interventions we've developed for patients right the way through.
Thanks, Georgia. And I suppose to kind of pick up on a couple of those points that have been mentioned by Sue, Andrew and Georgia at this is, you know, we can look at the very clinical side of things, the patient care side of things with qualitative research, but also itself nicely to the educational environment as well, and the professional environment. Cynthia, would you just like to talk a little bit about your later in life research career, and what really was the motivation for you to start a very long career in radio?
Well, I've had a lifelong interest and passion, and I have to absolutely totally agree with Andrew in that if you don't have the passion for what you do when you're doing the PhD, I wouldn't say it's doomed to failure, but it would be a very tough ride, because it's long and challenging, and you need to really care about what you're doing and what you're trying to find. And if that passion is not there, then it's hard to stay motivated. It really is. So I'd had a lifelong interest in radiography from a very international perspective, and I'd been involved with the ISRT for many years. I'd sat in meetings and workshops where we tried to develop global standards of education and scope of practice. We'd sent out numerous surveys to try and find the sort of the common elements of what it was that radiographers did around the world. And yet these all ended up in, I wouldn't say failure, but there was just something that just wasn't clicking. And I really had this strong passion to try and figure out what were the issues here, what were the impediments to trying to develop a really global framework for what we did. Because on the surface, one could, and I'm talking about diagnostic radiography, on the surface it looks like a deceptively simple activity, that we're all doing the same thing and we all need a same basis of knowledge. So what is it that makes it so different and so hard to, in fact, implement something in a global capacity? And so that was the impetus. The other reason, I think, well, there were two reasons why I went the qualitative route. One was that I'd seen surveys come back, and I knew very well, because I knew a lot of the people that were filling in these surveys, they were filling it in the way that they thought you wanted to get the answers for. So although try as we might to make a survey truly objective to eke out the information that you need, it really still depends on how that person is completing that survey. And there was no question that people were filling it in, answering it in the way they thought we wanted the answers to be. So I knew there was another dimension behind that. The other reason I went qualitative is I have to tell you, it's because I hate statistics. I mean, I might as well put that on the table there, you know. I do them, I recognize the importance of them, but it's not a passion for me at all. I would rather spend hours interviewing, poring over results, poring over language and trying to interpret that rather than poring over a bunch of figures. So I'm being perfectly honest with you on that one. But for me, it involved a lot of field work. I did basically an ethnography really in 7 countries, doing field work in 7 countries, which I deliberately chose from different cultural dimensions. So I was in Muslim countries, Asian countries, developing countries, and then the States and Australia and the UK. So I managed to get a really wide diversity. And I think this is the other thing, and Andrew mentioned this as well, in that within the context of what he was looking at, he was dealing with a bunch of diverse situations, from people going through experiences in small clinics versus big tertiary institutions. And on a more global perspective, I was dealing with the same thing. The difference between working in a big tertiary establishment in Australia compared to a small little hospital in rural India. They've still got radiographers, but boy, are they doing something very, very different. And that's what fascinated me. And so that was the real impetus why I went this route.
Thanks, everybody. I'll hand back over to Gay now. Just unmute, Gay, please.
Thank you, Caro. What we're interested to hear now is like, what were some of the what support did you have, and who provided this? And then, just in the interest of time, maybe if you can also talk a little bit about, even though you're talking about support, maybe some of the barriers or challenges that you had during that process, and maybe how did that support help with those barriers and challenges? So maybe we'll start with you, Cynthia.
Okay. I was very fortunate in a way in that I managed to find supervisors, two amazing supervisors who were incredibly supportive of what I was doing. What was extra interesting is neither of them were radiographers. And I wondered to begin with whether this would be an impediment or a barrier. In actual fact, it proved the reverse, because I had to justify everything I said. You know, we speak a language in radiography. We understand kind of what we're thinking and why we're thinking. And suddenly there's somebody coming in and saying, but why are you saying that? And what is this? And so constantly I had to justify everything that I was thinking and doing. And that, in fact, ended up being a huge benefit to me. And so I actually did not find that an impediment at all. So I do think a big secret is having supportive supervisors. I was fortunate in, by this time I was working part-time. I was almost semi-retired. I mean, this is the perfect time to do a PhD, except it's 30 years too late, unfortunately. But it is a great time to do it because you have a little bit more time. So that was not such an issue with me. And again, being able to do the field work, I was able to make use of wonderful relationships and that I developed over the years throughout the world. And so that made all of that much easier to follow. Any barriers? Well, you know, there were always certain barriers depending where you want. They needed huge ethical approval. You know, in India, all I needed was a letter with a stamp on it. When I went to the UAE, I had to go through a complete ethics approval situation. So, you know, it depending what site. I mean, those were things that just took up a lot of time, that whole ethics approval, once you go beyond your own sort of immediate environment. The other one, which I found very interesting actually, was the acceptance that you could in fact do qualitative research in radiography. Balderston made a wonderful comment, I think it was back in 2014, where she said that only 5% of all, at that time anyway, only 5% of all published material from radiography or radiation therapy was actually qualitative. Part of her argument was, the reason for that was that most of the reviewers for articles were quantitative and therefore did not necessarily have the knowledge, skills, aptitude or attitude to find qualitative material to be as accepting. Now, I think that's changed. I mean, look at the number of us that are doing the qualitative now. So I think that balance has definitely shifted, but it was not that long ago. And I think partially, I'm going to say from diagnostic point of view, I think that because we lagged behind in the development of a research culture, we felt very much that it had to be very hard-nosed and quantitative for us to be taken seriously. And that if we were going to be doing all this kind of soft stuff, that we really wouldn't be taken seriously. So I think there was definitely a very strong bias towards the quantitative. And there was good reason for that. If you're looking at the clinical environment, obviously you need to have the quantitative. But I think the balance has changed now, and I think we've become a more mature profession. If you just have to look at nursing and that kind of thing, they have a lot more qualitative. They can be very introspective about what they do and how they do it, and I think we need to do that too. So I think what used to be a barrier is definitely changing, but that was certainly I think a bit of an issue. And I have just one sort of anecdote. I did one field work, was in Taiwan. I wanted an Asian community because they do have a very sort of a technological way of doing things, and a different concept of patient care and that sort of thing. They had a very hard time understanding why I, as a radiographer, would want to sort of ask questions and do things in a qualitative way. And one radiographer specifically said to me, why are you doing this? So I said, you've been qualified for 30 years. Has anybody in that last 30 years asked you the kind of questions that I'm asking you about what you're doing, why you're doing, and if you enjoy it? And she said, well, no, nobody's ever asked me. I said, well, that's why I'm doing it now. So I think we have a role to play, but it's still a developing role.
Great. Lots of good ideas in there, Cynthia. Thank you. We'll just move on. So, Sue, have you...
Okay. Well, the first, what I thought was a big barrier about having heard about Cynthia's experiences, maybe not so, was the ethics approval. I guess because you think you just got everything down and you put it in and it'll get through. So I was a bit upset when it didn't go through the first time, and Georgia said that was very normal, and we went through all that process. But eventually I got ethics approval initially, and then it was a bit easier once I'd got that through Curtin, because then I went to one of the big institutions in Melbourne to do my observations, most of them, and I got ethics approval there quite quickly, because once I got it through Curtin University, they were quite happy for me to have an expedited ethics approval. And then that happened to the next centre that I went to, which was in Adelaide, and that once again, that because I already had the approval of the other two, that seemed to make it like, okay, that's fine with us as well. So it's something that not to get upset about, but to know that it's actually, in everyone's best interests that you do get the appropriate approval. So that seemed like a barrier at the time, but it wasn't really at all. Also, I guess along the way, I found that there were a number of what we would call gatekeepers, having talks with the management first to be able to even contemplate going in and not observing. And at first, it was, well, why would you want to do that? And what's this all about? And I had to give a presentation to the staff, and this is what I'd like to do. And there were a lot of different things. But I think having that fact that I was actually a radiation therapist helped me over the line, because I don't know how many radiation therapists would have liked someone that wasn't a radiation therapist observing them day in, day out. Having said that, with my supervisors, Georgia was, her background's radiation therapy, but then I also had Moira, who is in psychology, and I had a third supervisor because at the time when I was undertaking my studies, I was doing it through Curtin, which is in Perth, but I had temporarily moved from Adelaide to Melbourne to undertake my observations, and I was living in Melbourne for the 3 years that I was undertaking most of the data collection and analysis before I returned to Adelaide. So it was, the distance was possibly sometimes a barrier, particularly in daylight saving times with Perth, however, how many hours, Georgia? 3 is it 3 hours, I think, different to Melbourne. So, you know, you come up with this light bulb moment of something you wanted to discuss with them, but you have to wait because they're not around. They're, you know, you can't wake them up at midnight when you've come up with some fantastic thoughts about things. So that was a barrier, but it was also, I think, brought us even closer together. They were really supportive because I was quite a way away from them. And my third supervisor, she had a nursing background and she was minimal amount of input, but she met me regularly once a month or so for coffee so that I could debrief. So she was also a mentor in a sense to talk about some of the difficulties and what I was finding a struggle at some of the points. And as Cynthia alluded to, that it is challenging. So if you're not passionate about your subject, then I think it would be truly difficult, because there were times when I found that line in the sand that I had to get over seemed to be moving and I wasn't getting there. But as my son said to me one day when I was a little distraught, he just said, "Mum, you're nearly there. We're all waving at you. You're going to get there in the end." So you do persevere because you're that far along and that you can't turn back. But I think the support, though, that I had was fantastic from family and from my superior, my supervisors, and even down to some of the management actually that allowed me into these places because I was open and honest about what I was doing, and I was happy to talk about what we hope to get from it, which ultimately, my ultimate drive was to improve or to enhance our patient-centred practice and to show that, hopefully was wanting to highlight the fact that radiation therapists can support the patient because they see them on a daily basis and they can help them through some really difficult and tough times. Don't have to be counsellors, just have to be there for them. So that just continued it for me. And I think that's how I got over a lot of the challenges. Certainly writing up, getting through all the data analysis. I don't know about you, Cynthia, because you went to I don't know how many places, but I found I had so much data and so much analysis to get through, and then to write this thesis. It was exciting, difficult, challenging, and all of those things. So, but fantastic experience. It's the journey. It's not necessarily even the end product, but it's the journey and getting there.
Great. So lots of support from your supervisors is obviously has helped you along, Sue.
Definitely.
Yeah. Andrew.
Okay, I'm going to answer these questions in reverse. The biggest barrier I had was my first supervisor, who came from a dentistry background, and there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, it was educationally based, but I found in the meetings we had, it'd end up just being a chat and I wasn't given any direction, and I needed the direction to be able to put together what I was trying to do. And then when we left Sydney and moved here to Wagga, I kept communicating with her, but I didn't have a reply from her for 18 months. And that was a massive barrier. So in the end, my wife, who's been my greatest support, said to me, "You've got to flick her and find someone new." So at that stage, Charles Sturt University had an institution that was called the Education for Practice Institute. And so I emailed Professor Joy Higgs, who was the director of EFPI, and she said, "Yep, we'll take you on." And I ended up with both the directors of EFPI, Joy Higgs and Franziska Treder, as being my co-supervisors. And that leads to the support I had, because they were just amazing. Now, I can only very strongly endorse what Cynthia said earlier about having supervisors from a non-MRS background. To me, it was a bonus. They are both from a physiotherapy background, so they have that knowledge of health and health education. But, for example, they were able to tell me their experiences as a non-radiographer going into an X-ray department. And that to me was really eye-opening to hear from other health professionals who know how a health professional should act, and then comparing that with how the radiographers they encountered actually did act. And often there was a big gulf between what should happen and what did happen. And we were able to draw lessons from that and take it back into our work on assessment of students in the workplace. The other thing that I found a great support from my supervisors is that they were both very direct. And for me, I like that. I can't stand it when people beat around the bush. And so I said to them right at the beginning of the journey, if my work's rubbish, please tell me it's rubbish. Tell me it's hopeless. Be blunt with me, because it's how I operate. Now, that may not work for everyone, but it worked for me. And it was just cutting through the rubbish and being able to know that if they told me my work was good, then it actually really was good. And to me, that was the biggest source of support that I had from my supervisors. So I'll cut it short there, but to me, they were the barriers, and the support all came through my experiences with supervision. And just let me quickly say, I agree with what Cynthia said about there being very little qualitative research in diagnostic. It is improving, but we're still lepers to some extent, but it is getting better.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I think probably it always is challenging choosing the right supervisors and having the correct people who are there for you. And I think that you probably have to have a bit of a personality interest as well, so that you get on, so that you can be honest with each other. Yeah. Anyway, Georgia, shall we move on? We're going to run out of time,
Yep.
I think. Yes.
So as far as supervisors, essential to have the right ones. I, like the others, have had a multidisciplinary team when I was doing my PhD. And I guess that's continued throughout my research, where I'm always working with a whole range of people, including psychologists, nurses, radiation therapists, radiation oncologists, as many different people that are relevant to the project, and as well as the statisticians, the health economists or qualitative experts. It's always good to have that big range of a team. And I guess having the clinical links and the university links reduces some of the barriers as well. When I did my PhD, it was very uncommon for radiation therapists or radiographers to be doing research. So that was a barrier, but I think it's getting a lot better now that there is some of us doing research and there's more support. And I guess beyond doing the PhD, having that multidisciplinary team has been essential, and having different perspectives. And having, I guess, when I was doing my PhD, I had PhD buddies, so I had people to talk to that were my peers as well, and getting that support at that level is good. So whether you're doing a small project in the department, you've got your peers that you're working with to bounce ideas off, as well as your supervisors or your mentors. Sorry. So it's good getting a big range of perspective and having that opportunity to debrief and make sure you're relevant to your project. Having consumers as well, having patients feed into your projects as well, making sure it's relevant has been good as well. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Georgia. So, sounds like you might have a supporter right there. Kaz, I'll move on to you. Right.
Great. So what we might do, we did have a few other questions on the list, and as Gay, we are kind of running a bit short of time, so I might just pose one of the questions and not invite everybody to answer each question. It did sound like we had a couple of panel members who undertook ethnographic study. While we're not going to talk about the approaches taken to qualitative research in this webinar, what I would like to just explore a little bit and get some insight into is the data collection methods that you used, and also I will then pay to analysis methods. So I might just start with Sue, because I think you did an ethnographic study in the field, and if you can just talk a bit about how you actually collected your data and what kind of data you collected. Thank you.
Data collection for me was mainly through observations, and so I had my little notebook. I would be taking down in my own little shorthand my notes on a daily basis. I used to go into radiation therapy department, and I observed mainly in the treatment areas, and I made sure I went in at different times of the day, so I didn't miss out on different aspects of, you know, whether it was early morning or a late shift or over the lunch period or whatever. So there were long days of just watching, listening, and reading some of the notes and things that would come through, and go to different meetings, and so a lot of observation. But in doing that, I also had some very informal chats or interviews with some of the radiation therapists and some of the other people that were working in the area, and you know, and even just chatting with the patients just to get a feel for am I observing it, you know, because I'm looking through it through my lens, looking at it, but as a researcher hat on, not my RT hat on. And so it was definitely a lot of observations, a lot of writing down different scenarios and situations. And then from that, I actually then invited a number of people to be interviewed. So we had some more formal interviews where I had some questions that I needed to ask as a result of what I had observed. But then I also asked patients very open-ended questions of, can you tell me a bit about your experiences coming here for treatment? You know, and what do you think of where you have to wait, and your interactions with radiation therapists? You know, how has that been? How have you found it? All those sorts of very open-ended questions. So some formal, some informal interviews, some and to follow up at the end of my observations when I observed at 2 different big institutions. Then I had some I called them group interviews. So I invited a few people, like focus groups, to just go through what their experiences have been in the clinical setting, in where they worked, and to gather more of the cultural aspects of radiation therapists in their work, because that underlies a lot of what they do and how they do it, and the perspectives of interacting with their patients. And so there was all different things and reading different literature that was within the departments, getting an understanding of that underlying culture through a lot of the different documents and so on. And you know, as I said, I actually did go to some of the meetings. I was allowed in. You know, I didn't participate in the actual discussions, but I was allowed to observe what went on at the different meetings that they had as well. So it was all about learning about that culture and what the underlying culture in order to understand better or to explore those interactions between the patients and the radiation therapists. So I also talked to some of the nurses involved and had some informal chats with cleaner and the receptionists and so on, just to understand the workings of each of those two big departments. Data collection, so therefore there was an awful lot of notes, which then when I came out, I would be writing what my day was, and then my journal reflections as well, thinking about that. And so it was a lot of handwritten data, and then the analysis, I did a lot of it. I typed everything up. I got the interviews that were, of course, recorded as well as some notes written down. So they were all transcribed, and then I had to go through those, and everything was on my computer, but also I printed out loads and loads and loads of data, and then I cut bits out and put different themes, and I did a lot of theming through a very manual and long-winded process. But I felt like I'd really got to know the data, and I really was immersed in it, so it was really good. Having said that, this time with working with Caroline, it's been quite nice to use NVivo, and it's a totally different way of looking at things, but still coming out with some really interesting analysis.
Thanks, Sue. And in the interest of time, I think what we will do is, I've seen lots of the messages on the message board, and perhaps look at organising another webinar that perhaps concentrates on design methods, given that we are very near to the conclusion of this webinar. So if everybody's happy, what I might just do to round up is to ask each of the panel members what your two top tips are for qualitative research. It can be starting out, it can be aspects of qualitative research, what your two top tips are. And I might start with Cynthia.
Okay, my two top tips, I guess, are to be patient and realistic. I'm putting that in one, in that it's always going to take longer than you think. So you have to be prepared for the long slog. Be open to criticism. Be prepared to critique yourself. And the other one is, in spite of our talking about this soft science, do be consistent, careful, use your language in a very consistent manner, so that you do need to be really organized. Your questions in your semi-structured interviews need to be very carefully thought out. So every part of it, in spite of it being qualitative, every part has to be super organized. So if it isn't, you're going to end up in a big mess of stuff that's going to be really hard to interpret. So I guess those are my two.
Thanks, Cynthia. And certainly that rigour, although we're not dealing with numbers and methods that are akin to quantitative, you still have to have the rigour in your methods, in your process, in ensuring that your data and your assumptions from the data are true to what your aims and objectives are. So thank you for that, Cynthia. I'll just ask Georgia now what your top tips, two top tips are for qualitative research.
Yep, so I would say consumer involvement right from the beginning and getting their input on what you're asking people is one of my key things for research projects. And also the multidisciplinary team and getting their input when you're starting the project. And I guess also with that is the research question and making sure that you're answering the research question with the right method and working through that and getting your proposal right for the question that you're asking.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Georgia. Andrew, 2 top tips for qualitative research. Thank you.
Okay. Number 1, pick a topic that you're really, really interested in. And number 2, when you fall over, get up again. Very simple.
Excellent. Sometimes there's bruises and Sue, I think, no, who have I missed? Sue, have I asked you your 2 top tips?
No.
Well, thank you.
My 2 are to make sure you look after yourself, and that is use of a reflective journal, so that because that really can help you with those aha moments, and it also helps you really think about how well you are travelling or not travelling at the time. And I always suggest, and it doesn't matter what level you're doing, whether you're doing PhD or whatever, have a mentor, someone that's not directly related or involved in it, but they're professional, probably a health professional, maybe, but someone that's slightly removed from it, but someone that you can go to and you know that you can sit and entrust them with your thoughts, and they can help you to help yourself think about things, rather than they won't give you the answers, but it makes you reflect even more. So I think that there are 2 things that can help you keep on the straight and narrow and not fall down too often, hopefully.
Thanks, Sue. Yes, having a buddy that you can talk to, the main not research team, I think is really important for your own well-being. Sometimes I think often you can get overloaded, and it's really useful to be able to share your thoughts and get different perspectives as well. So I'd like to thank the panel for being generous, for sharing their experiences, the good, the bad, and not very often the ugly. But I think it's about building up that picture, that support network for qualitative researchers. Certainly our research network has quite a few people that are emerging and also experienced qualitative researchers. So if anybody is interested in looking at how they can develop their skills further or establishing collaborative projects, small scale, large scale, the network is very much over time. Once again, I would like to thank the panel, thank Gay for co-hosting, thank Peter for organising, thank everybody for joining us, and we'd love to carry on this conversation perhaps into part 2, perhaps in 2020. I'm happy to hang around for 5 minutes or so in case anybody does have any questions. Otherwise, thank you everybody for joining us, and good evening.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you.